A city of brick and smoke became a calculator's nightmare and an empire's trap. On 19th November 1942, when Soviet artillery ripped open the frozen steppe north and south of Stalingrad, the fate of Germany's Sixth Army was not sealed by heroics at the barricades, but by tonnage, range tables, and the limits of winter skies. The guns announced Operation Uranus. The math pronounced a death sentence. Within days, more than 250,000 Axis troops found themselves inside a tightening ring that demanded at least 500 tons of supplies per day to survive, while an overstretched Luftwaffe struggled to deliver even a fraction under relentless weather and Soviet air pressure. The story of Stalingrad's encirclement is therefore not only about ruined factories and house-to-house fighting, it is about the brutal arithmetic of logistics, leadership driven by prestige and illusions, and the moment when numbers outshouted will. The trap did not spring by accident. Soviet planning for Uranus had been deliberate, patient, and cold-blooded, marshalling reserves across a continent while masking intent behind the rubble and smoke of the city's front edge. The Red Army aimed not at the German spearhead strongest at the point, but at its brittle haft, the poorly equipped Romanian Third and Fourth Armies anchoring the flanks. When the barrage lifted on the morning of 19th November, Soviet armour and mechanized infantry smashed through positions with patchy anti-tank defences, then flowed west and south across open steppe before turning inward. This operational geometry to scything thrusts converging at Kalach was classic deep battle doctrine, but its magnificence only became clear when pincer tips clasped hands across the Don. Axis command had seen the build-up, yet misread its purpose, assuming a limited effort to relieve Soviet forces inside the city rather than a grand encirclement. That misdiagnosis cost time, and time was the rarest commodity once the jaws began to close. Behind the lines, staff officers did what soldiers in crisis often must. They counted. Divisions, attached brigades, service troops, fragments of Allied units falling back into the pocket. The ledger climbed past 250,000, then toward 280,000 and more. Experienced logisticians knew what those figures implied. The Demyansk airlift earlier in 1942 had sustained roughly 100,000 men with about 300 tons per day and nearly 500 Ju-52 transports flying themselves ragged under far gentler opposition. Scaling that to Stalingrad's mass meant 700, 800 tons daily, a number that instantly collided with reality. The Luftwaffe simply did not own enough serviceable transports, sufficient airfields of adequate capacity, or the meteorological grace to keep such a bridge aloft in December. The Volga steppe winter takes its tithe in ice, wind, and fog. The VVS exacted the rest with fighters and flak. The arithmetic was pitiless. Yet arithmetic still had to fight ideology. Adolf Hitler's order was unequivocal: hold Stalingrad. Retreat was not a military option, but a moral outrage in his lexicon, a negation of will. Hermann Göring, seeking to restore his standing, promised the army could be supplied by air and assurance made without a sober survey of capacity, conditions, or attrition. On paper, optimistic Luftwaffe staffers could sketch 350 tons per day in perfect weather. In practice, the 70-day average would tally under 100, with some late December days struggling to crest 200 even at their best. Every shortfall compounded inside the pocket as rations dwindled to emaciating levels and ammunition allocations withered to the bare minimums for local defence. An army, it is said, marches on its stomach. At Stalingrad, it stood still on empty bowls. Inside the Kessel, the cauldron, the fight turned inward as much as outward. Command posts traded situation maps where red arrows multiplied like frost patterns on glass. Fuel triage meant immobile armour hunkering as gunpoints, while horses, once the motive power of German logistics, became ration meat in sausages that tasted of defeat. The great urban brawl that had chewed battalions to bone before the encirclement gave way to positional survival. Conserve, endure, hope for a corridor. Even veteran NCOs, steady in the factory halls and the grain elevator, now whispered the only question that mattered. Could Manstein's relief arrive before the ledger of calories and cartridges went to zero? Operation Winter Storm, Winter Gewitter was the answer the High Command tried to write in steel across the snowfields. Erich von Manstein, perhaps Germany's most deft operational mind, drove elements of 4th Panzer Army from Kotelnikovo in mid-December, converging along the Aktuba and Mishkova with a plan as daring as the weather was cruel. His staff recognized the essence. A relief without an internal breakout was a bridge to nowhere. The relief spearheads came within roughly 40-50 miles of the pocket at their zenith, a hair in map scale, a wasteland in tracked kilometres under fire. Without powerless striking outward to meet them, abandoning heavy kit, loading only the fuel and ammo that could be pulled by men, and surviving motors, the corridor could not be held nor sustained. The Soviet response, Operation Little Saturn, clawed south and west, threatening Manstein's flanks and lines of communication, forcing calculated withdrawal. The window slammed shut as hard as the steppe freezes. Why did the breakout not come? Loyalty to command culture, to be sure. General Friedrich Paulus embodied a Prussian obedience that made insubordination to the Führer unimaginable, even when the map screamed otherwise. He requested permission to withdraw, while it might still be done with cohesion, but rejected the leap into mutiny when permission was denied. Manstein, operating from outside the cauldron, calculated that a breakout could work only if coordinated with his thrust. Without authorization, he would not order Paulus to rebel. Between those poles' principled obedience and political calculation, an army shivered and waited. Historians have debated this fulcrum ever since, but the physics of supply allowed little ambiguity by late December. The airlift, often framed as a dramatic gamble, was in truth a slow-motion collapse mediated by brave crews flying into a meat grinder of ice and fire. Pitomnik and Gumrak, the airfields inside the pocket, were lifelines and bullseyes, lit by rationed fuel and defended by men already counting their last rifle rounds. Junkers without de-icing fluid queued on frozen runways, while ground crews with frostbitten hands unloaded crates that contained, sometimes, the wrong precious cargo for the day's crisis. As Soviet artillery crept nearer and fighters prowled the approaches, landing became as deadly as combat, and takeoff an act of faith. The tonnages tell the story better than any rhetoric. Across roughly 10 weeks, about 6,500 tons reached the 6th Army, barely a day and a half of true need. Numbers alone make verdicts inevitable. Outside the pocket, the Eastern Front itself was shifting beneath German boots. Stalingrad had absorbed not only formations, but focus. To hold a city named for the Soviet leader had become a matter of prestige strategically divorced from geometry. While the 6th Army froze, Stavka's broader design Saturn, in its variants chiseled, at the axis position along the Don Basin, and threatened the rear of Army Group A in the Caucasus. The Germans had outrun their logistic umbilicals in summer's euphoria. Winter charged interest on every kilometre gained without proper rails, depots and redundancy. The Red Army, by contrast, had learned to stack reserves, to rotate formations, and to accept the cost of operational depth in exchange for decisive encirclement. Stalingrad was its first full harvest. Urban warfare remained the city's visible theatre, But winter logistics became the true antagonist. Even a well-provisioned army struggles to fight amid sub-zero winds that turn machine oil to glue and split skin at a touch. A starving army becomes a garrison of ghosts. Medical officers recorded frostbite where boots had been traded for bread, infections where bandages were as rare as morphine, and 1,000 quiet surrenders of flesh to cold. Ammunition rationing turned platoon actions into equations. How many rounds to beat off an assault? How many left for tomorrow's? Mortars fired by the single bomb. Batteries saved their shells for when the enemy's mass was unmistakable. The romance of stubborn defence melted, and only the arithmetic remained. Even the German precedent at Demyansk, so often invoked to justify hope, was a mirage when examined closely. Demyansk had a smaller pocket, more favourable air conditions, fewer Soviet air interdictions, and an air fleet committed almost to breaking to maintain an average tonnage that Stalingrad would have needed to double or triple. The argument from precedent collapsed under comparative load. What sustained 100,000 for weeks could not scale to nearly 3 times that number under harsher skies and stronger Soviet opposition. Hitler's court preferred metaphors. The steppe demanded math. By late December, the daily rhythm inside the Kessel had become a metronome of reduction. Rations fell toward skeletal norms. Accounts from both sides describe men fighting in a slow ballet of exhaustion, where movement was measured in breaths, not strides. The Luftwaffe, its crews displaying a grim courage beyond the folly of their orders, continued to fly losing aircraft to weather, accidents, and interceptors that had learned the lanes into Potomnik like hunters knowing a game trail. When Potomnik fell and Gumrak became the last strip, the air bridge narrowed to a thread. When Gumrak too was lost, the thread snapped. Whatever remained would be delivered by parachute, the wrong solution to the wrong problem at the wrong time. Operation Winter Storm's failure forced a terrible acknowledgement. No road led out that did not begin with disobedience. Paulus, promoted at the end to Field Marshal Hitler's signal that no such rank had ever surrendered, and thus should die at his post-chose capitulation rather than the suicide implicit in that tradition. In the last days, Soviet units moved through a landscape of cellars and snowdrifts, collecting prisoners who were more bone than uniform. The battle that had begun as a duel for a river metropolis ended as a clinic in attrition. When the firing finally faded on 2 February 1943, more than an army had been lost. The aura of German invincibility had been punctured irreparably. What Stalingrad taught beyond the courage and cruelty ubiquitous in war is that operational art cannot defy the physics of supply, and that prestige is a ruinous general. The Red Army's encirclement succeeded because it targeted weakness at depth and because it synchronized shock with exploitation and reserve commitment. The Axis defense failed because it placed faith in an air bridge whose pylons were aircraft that did not exist and weather windows that did not open. Future campaigns on both sides would absorb these lessons. The Soviets refining their taste for deep operations and cauldron battles. The Germans recognizing too late that boldness without logistics is merely theatre. There were alternatives, but none costless. A breakout within the first 48-72 hours of Uranus, using remaining fuel to punch west while the ring was fluid, might have saved a large fraction of the Sixth Army at the price of abandoning the city and much equipment. Coordinated with Manstein's advance, such a gambit had a plausible, if painful, logic. But each day's delay narrowed the corridor and drained the tanks literal and figurative. By mid-December, the breakout calculus veered from difficult to bleak. Historians differ on the exact tipping point, but the consensus narrows it to the weeks before Winter Storm crested and fell back. After that, the ledger wrote itself in ice. The airlift's post-war autopsy has been equally unsparing. Studies quantify what the men already knew. Across the period from late November to January, delivered tonnage averaged below 100, 120 tonnes per day, with spikes insufficient to alter the starvation curve. Single best days barely scratched the minimum daily requirement, and the whole effort delivered the equivalent of a little over a day of full sustenance spread thinly across 10 weeks. The Luftwaffe's transport arm, rated for far less than was demanded, suffered serviceability issues, high accident rates under winter conditions, and a Soviet air defense environment that grew stronger by the week. Heroism, again, could not turn scarcity into sufficiency. Stalingrad's strategic shock radiated far beyond the Volga. For the Wehrmacht, it forced a reappraisal of the feasibility of deep penetrations without secured flanks and sufficient reserves, and it stripped manpower and material that could never be replaced at the same quality. For the Soviets, it confirmed the utility of massed artillery, operational maneuver, and relentless logistical build-up timed to the enemy's culmination. Diplomatically, it bolstered Allied confidence that the Eastern Front would absorb and then roll back German power, a confidence that shaped strategic choices in 1943. The hinge turned, and with it the war's balance. And yet, inside these grand arcs, the granular truths matter most for memory. A private warming his hands over a guttering brazier, a pilot coaxing a laden Ju-52 through ground fog toward flares he cannot trust, a staff captain drawing a line from Kotelnikovo and tracing how close salvation came and how far. Wars are decided by tides of industry and doctrine, but they are experienced by men counting biscuits and bullets. At Stalingrad, the counts ran out. In the end, the lesson is severe and simple. Do not confuse possibility with capacity. Do not let symbolism command troops. Do not ask aircraft to replace railways in winter against an enemy that flies and fights back. The Red Army's plan worked because it honoured the constraints of distance, weather, and enemy weakness. The Axis plan failed because it defied those constraints with promises and promotions. Between those two poles lies the frozen truth of Stalingrad, where an army learned that courage cannot be eaten, and where numbers, ton by ton, mile by mile, day by day, decided the outcome.